Janome.
Hello everyone and welcome to Live with Janome. I'm Miriam Coffey. I'm an education specialist here at Janome America, and welcome to my studio. And today is a very exciting video because today we're kicking off Janome's summertime skill builder giveaway. And so not only is this going to be, so it's going to be a 12-week program. So every week for 12 weeks on Wednesday, 3 p.m. on Eastern time, we're going to be doing our Facebook Live videos just like we have for the last couple years. And we're going to be doing videos on different skills. And what you're going to do is you're going to be able to post video, or just post a picture of you of like the skill that you just practiced from the last video that we just did. And you will post that, and then we're going to have a really cool, we're going to have a link from each video. Sorry, little brain fart there. We're going to have a link for each video that allows you to go to our website, and we're going to have all of the information about the program or about the giveaway, because we're going to be doing 5 different giveaways. It's going to be at the end, so that's going to be on August 25th, or it ends on 24th, so maybe it's like the next day. I have to double check, but all of the information is going to be on the website. We're going to have a link there, so if I got any of the information wrong, it's all there. And so it's going to be a really fun program, and especially because I'm excited to kick it off with this video, which is one of my favorite techniques, and I think it's a really kind of like underutilized and often skipped technique in the sewing world. I know I skipped it for many years because I didn't really understand it. And also because I'm a self-taught sewer that doesn't always read directions and sometimes just makes things up as they go. So when I would read instructions, sometimes if I didn't understand something, you sometimes just skip it because you're just like, I don't know. But so a lot of times understitching is that for a lot of people, and I know I'm not alone. So what understitching is, it's a way of sewing a seam down so that when you turn it, it doesn't roll back. So it's primarily done in the garment sewing world, but I'm going to show you a bunch of different ways you can use it in not just garments, but in quilts or in just general sewing. It's one of those things that is a total game changer once you learn about it. I know it was for me in my sewing sort of career. Once I learned how to do it, I was like, why did I not do this years ago? Why do I not follow instructions sometimes? And this is why, because sometimes, you know, reading instructions is very important, and sometimes just because it doesn't, so like understitching is one of those things that if you skip it, it may not look like it's that big of a deal, but when you actually do it, it makes the world of a difference. So we're just going to jump into it because I'm sure you guys are really excited, because I know I'm excited to show it to you. So this is an example of understitching. So when you sew something down, and you want to, so you've got the seam here, and I want to turn this so that I have a nice crisp edge on either side. It can be really hard because you can spend a lot of time kind of wiggling this back and forth to make sure that it's evenly distributed and that it's not rolling back to one side or the other. And that's when understitching comes into play. So this is an example of understitching, and this hasn't even been pressed. This just kind of, once you do it, it kind of falls into place. So I'm going to open this up here. So I have 2 different colored threads here to show you what each one is. So this red stitching is my construction seam. So that's the seam right here. And then what I did is I sewed my seam allowance, which is this right here, to my lining, because I want the yellow print to be my outside fabric and my gray is my lining. So, and this is going to be for any, whether or not you're doing this to a quilt or a facing, it's always going to be to the part that it's going to be on the back or the lining. So we want our seam to go towards the lining. So I would sew this down, which is this black stitching. And then once you sew it down, it kind of automatically pushes itself to the back and lays nice and flat. And what's even better is that not only does it lay nice and flat, but it actually rolls back to where you have maybe a couple threads of the outside fabric towards on the back side. So you don't get any of that lining showing on the front of your project, because if you are lining something with a different fabric or a different color, you don't want to see that poking out in the front of a, like say, your neckline. It would really be just kind of visually distracting. So some of you might be wondering, why couldn't I just top stitch this? Well, first of all, there are a lot of examples when you don't want top stitching, because top stitching can either be visually distracting, or you may not have a thread that matches exactly and you just don't want to disturb this nice crisp edge. By doing that understitching, you don't have to worry about that top stitching being kind of distracting. So I'm going to show you a few examples. So here is a dress that I made a long time ago, and it has a sweetheart neckline, and so it is fully lined, and it's actually lined with the same fabric, so you can't really necessarily tell, but you can see how it pulled that lining to the back, and you're not going to see any of that lining fabric coming to the front, even though it is the same fabric. But if I had had a contrasting fabric, you would not have seen it, because it's rolled all the way to the back, and you see that that front fabric kind of rolling to the back, so that I have a nice crisp line here. One of the other ways I really love using understitching is for when I face quilts. So I really like to face quilts because sometimes, especially wall hangings, sometimes when you do a small wall hanging, putting a big binding on it can be kind of distracting. So when you face a quilt, I love to do understitching on my facing. I just think it looks really nice. It helps roll it over, and we will stitch this out. But before we stitch out the quilt, I'm going to do a neckline first. So actually, before we do that, let's go over a few of the feet that you could use. So you could use just your standard A foot and use any of the markings that are on the foot, or you can move your needle. I really like to use either the S foot, which is the stitch in the ditch foot. So I use my ditch along my seam. So let's pull this up here. Move these both out of the way. So I have this is my outside fabric, my lining, and my seam allowance is going to be on my lining. So if I use my S foot and I move my needle over to here, that's going to give me a perfectly parallel stitch with my seam. And then it's going to be nice and straight, and it's going to be really easy. And because that little flange there, it's going to just glide along that seam and keep it perfectly straight. So like, as you can see, like I'm just pushing it along here, and it just hugs that seam perfectly. Another great foot for this is one of my favorite feet, which is the SE foot, which is the edge guide foot. And this is a really cool foot for lots of different things, for either edge stitching or, again, understitching, which is what we're doing here. And what's nice about this is you can keep your needle, you can move your needle wherever you want, because there is the full 9mm opening, or you can also move your adjustable guide. So by using this little wheel here, this little screw, I can move my white guide to wherever I want it to go. And that's going to allow me to adjust it so that I can have whatever measurement I want. Most of the time when you're doing edge stitching, and this would actually be this way, I would actually have to flip it this way, and I would be, if I had my needle over here, it would just guide along there, and I'd be again sewing my seam allowance to my lining fabric or my facing, whatever I'm doing. And then I would just sew along there. Most of the time when you're doing understitching, you're going to want to use around 1/8 of an inch stitch from your seam to your lining. So just around 1/8 of an inch. It doesn't have to be precise, but around that is a great way of doing it. So let me just show you a few examples before we actually stitch it out. So I'll move that over there. So these are some little faux tops here. So this is an example of a faced top, and this has been pressed, so you can see how nice and crisp this is all the way around. And then if I flip it to the lining, you can see it's fully lined, and I've got that great, and of course I did this in a contrasting thread so that you guys could see it, and I have a little bit of that outside fabric coming to the lining so that I have a perfectly crisp, nice neckline. But what I also want to show you is that on this one, which has been understitched, but it hasn't been pressed, you can see how it already automatically wants to roll itself to the back. But if I was just trying to, so this is one that hasn't been top stitched yet, it doesn't really know, that seam doesn't really know what to do. And it may not be pushed all the way to the one side or sort of finagled to one side. And having that understitching is just going to pull it to the back and make it really nice and effortless. As you can see, just how nice that looks even before it's been pressed. It just automatically just kind of lays itself into place. So let's, I'm going to show you the facing of a quilt, how to face a quilt, because yes, traditionally this is done for garments, and so again, this would be for linings, necklines, all kinds of collars, things like that. But let's say you want to use this for other sewing, because it can be really helpful in all of your sewing world. So I love to use it when I face my quilts. I also really like to do it for bags too sometimes, because sometimes it's really nice to have a top stitch around your top of your bag. And that's really beautiful, and it can look really nice, especially if you do, let's say, a contrasting thread with a thicker thread. You can do some really, really beautiful decorative elements. But what if you don't want to see that top stitch around the top, but you don't want it to flip out and you don't want to spend all that time finagling it around? That's when the understitching around the inside, so you'd be you'd be understitching the lining from your seam allowance on the inside of your bag, and then it's just going to snug and just fit all the way on the inside, and you give that a good press. It's gonna be beautiful. So I don't have any stitch outs of a bag with that because I couldn't find it, so I do apologize, but I do have some quilts here. So this is doing a facing on a quilt. So again, there are so many different ways to do facing. There's so many different ways to bind quilts. There's, you know, so many different ways of doing anything, but this is one of the ways I like to face quilts when I don't want to see binding on the edges. Is I will sew a 4.5-inch strip onto the sides, all 4 sides, and then it will, when I understitch the sides, it will automatically help pull that quilt to the back, and then I'll just hand sew around the inside. So because this is so thick, because it's multiple layers of fabric plus the batting, it's gonna want to roll out. And by top stitching it, it really helps flatten it and roll itself to the back. If anybody's done facing before without understitching, you'll know how kind of much of a pain it can be to wiggle that seam and make sure that that seam allowance isn't puckering back onto the front of your quilt, and it doesn't give you a crisp line. That's why understitching is so fabulous for facing quilts. So I have a little faux quilt here. So this is, we're going to pretend this is my quilt. And this side I have faced. I have it started to be faced, and I have it understitched. This side is not, so we can go over this. So if I was just wanting to not understitch this, if I wanted to push this to back, I would press it. I would use my iron and I'd press it. But as you can kind of see, you can still see that lining or that facing. And I don't necessarily want to see that, because if I don't have the right fabric to face it with, because, you know, maybe I want to use some scraps, I don't want to see that facing. So when I understitch it, it's going to roll back, and you're not going to see any of that facing on the front of your quilt, or even from the side really. So I've top stitched, or no, I've understitched this I did not change thread color, so you'll have to just use, this is my construction seam, and then the second one is the understitch seam, where I'm sewing the seam allowance of the quilt to the facing. And this is when I would give it a good press, and then I create like a 1/2-inch fold on the other side, and then that's when I would hand sew this all the way down. Another trick to keep this from puckering out some, one, you can also understitch it with a zigzag to cover more surface. That can be helpful. The other thing is I sometimes will use a glue stick, and you can just kind of glue this down, and this helps keep it in place. Just, you know, this is washable, we all know that, so it's not going to hurt the quilt at all, but it can kind of help keep it in place, especially when you're hand sewing this down. And you can kind of see how that holds it in place a little bit better. Another thing that I like to do, if you have it, I'm a huge fan of this, of Wonder Tape, the double-sided fusible tape that's sticky. So I will sometimes do that as well, where I'll put that on my seam allowance, and I would break that, pull that back, and I could iron that into place, and that would keep this nice and flat, and it doesn't do that sort of puckery thing that can happen when you're working with a bunch of layers like a quilt sandwich. So I would do that for the same thing on this side. I would sew my seam allowance to my facing, and then that would automatically help flip it to the back. So I'm gonna move over to the front of the machine, and we can sew this down. Actually, before that, since I'm on this side, I want to show you one last thing. Let me put this over here. So one thing I wanted to show you, I wanted to show you two different ways to clip like a neckline or an arm. If you're doing like sleeve lift, if you're doing some sort of seam on a curve, you have to clip your seams to make it nice and smooth. So there's a couple ways you can do that. I'm going to show you two of the ways that I like to use. So a lot of times you're going to have a larger seam allowance. So you're going to have, say a pattern says this is, say it's going to be a little bit larger. If you're doing a curve, you want it to be, there's two ways of doing it. First, I sometimes like to do, I cut it 1/4 of an inch, or kind of like a scant 1/4 of an inch with pinking shears. And that's going to create those little, it has all those little V's. And that's going to help give you a really nice curve without having to cut into your project. So then when you turn this, and again, having an iron would be helpful, but this is going to be a lot easier to turn around. And you can see how nice, and there's no little, sometimes when you do those points, when you cut into your seam, you can get those like a kind of like a little divot or a sharp point on your curve. By using your pinking shears, it does not do that. So I'm a big fan of using my pinking shears for doing curves. The other way of doing curves that I like to do is I will trim it down to about 1/4 of an inch like this here. And then traditionally when they tell you to like notch a seam, they'll have you cut both layers a couple threads away from your seam. What I like to do is I actually like to stagger it where I will cut just one layer. It takes a little bit more time, but I'll cut just my top layer. So right now I'm just cutting that gray fabric. I'm going all the way around that curve, leaving a couple threads. Now I'm going to cut the reverse and cut my red fabric, the other side of the fabric, in between my two other cuts. So I have 2 cuts here on my gray fabric, and then I'll have a cut in the center of the red, and then another cut on my red fabric in between these 2 cuts. Same thing along here. And you can either flip it over and just kind of pay attention to where it is on the other side. But sometimes I find it to be easier to do it on the side that I can see where the 2 cuts are, and then flip it back and cut this. And what this prevents, yes, it is a little bit more time consuming, but it's going to give you a better curve, and it's going to help prevent those little kind of sharp points that can sometimes happen when you notch something. Let's do this last one. Okay. So now let's turn this. Now I would if this was say an armhole, I would again understitch this, and that's going to help it turn even faster. But if we're not going to understitch this one just yet, but this is going to pull this curve open, and you're going to see how you're not going to get those little points that sometimes happen when you're working on curves and you're notching it. So you can see how smooth that is. And again, once this was understitched, this is going to be even smoother, and it's just going to automatically pull itself to that back and just be really nice and beautiful. So both of these are great ways of trimming curves or notching curves out. So if you haven't tried either of these, I would recommend just trying this and seeing if you like it. And if you don't, no big deal. It's always good to try new things. So let's go ahead and stitch out some of our samples here. So first of all, I'm just going to touch my machine to kind of wake it up. And I'm going to attach my SE foot, and I'm going to lower it in place. And then I'm going to move my needle to the center. I'm going to put my thread behind. And this is a technique that you can use on any machine. It does not matter. And really you can do it with any foot. It just can be helpful with a foot that has some sort of guide to keep it really nice and straight and even with your seam. So again, I like the S foot or any sort of stitch in the ditch foot, or the SE, which is the edge guide foot. So I'm going to just show it to you on a regular piece of fabric before we do it on a curve. So anytime you're working on it, you'd want to make sure that your seam, again, is on, your seam allowance is on the lining or the facing of the fabric, which is, for my example, the gray fabric. So I'm going to lower my foot in place and pull this up a little bit. And this is when I could adjust this guide to any position. I'm happy with where it's dropping. That's around 1/8 of an inch from my seam. So I'm happy with that. But again, I could adjust this to whatever position, or again, I could also adjust my needle. Either or works great. And sometimes if you are working on something, it can be helpful to either, if it's really slippery or something, you may even want to glue base the seam or pin it in place if you're having trouble with it. If you're concerned about it flipping back and forth, you can always do that. But a lot of times I just you can feel it and just kind of every so often check to make sure it's on the right side and it hasn't accidentally flipped to the other side. So I'm going to go ahead and start sewing. And here we go. So you can see with that guide how easy that is and how it just perfectly lines up. Now obviously on a straight line it's always a little bit easier than it is on a curve, but I will show it to you on a curve. So we'll cut our threads. And then now we have our seam. And then when we flip it over, you can see how easy that flips over. And it does. I didn't have to finagle this like I did before. You can just see how easy that flips back. Another thing, so I'm going to show it to you on a curve here. So again, the yellow print is the outside and the gray is my facing or my lining, which I want my seam allowance to be sewn down. Another thing, especially with curves, it can be helpful to kind of hold your fabric on either side to make sure that it's not, you want to make sure that your seam is fully exposed and it's not like puckered in any way. And this is when making sure, feeling that your seam allowance is on the proper side. And again, I'm just going to sew along. And you will have to make a few more adjustments at this point, you know, when you're working with curves. This is when, if you have a machine that has auto pivot, it can be really helpful to turn that on. And that will, when I start sewing, you can kind of see here, if I just let this go, this might pucker a little bit. So that's why pulling your fabric a little bit, and we're not pulling it to stretch it in any way, we're just pulling it to kind of fully expose that seam so it's nice and flat. And stop. And reposition. This is something that you don't want to know. Oh, got a little wonky there. Sorry, guys. I'm not the best at sewing with the start stop. Readjust, and you can always double check to make sure that that seam is on the proper side. Again, readjust. Kind of pull that to make sure that that seam is fully exposed all the way to the end. Cut your threads. And then you can see, I just look at it just kind of falling back into place without any effort. It just fell back there and wanted to live on the back of my project versus having to fight to make sure that it's in the place that I want it to be. So I hope you guys are excited to play with understitching, because I know for me, when I learned about this, this was a total game changer. I was actually making 8 bridesmaids dresses for my best friend's wedding, and was doing this 2-tiered skirt, and the instructions said, and I piecemealed a bunch of different patterns together, so I was kind of not really paying attention to the instructions. And eventually, I think on the last one when I was making mine, I actually read that you should be using understitching, and then I looked it up and then did it, and then I was like, oh my gosh, this was such a time saver. Why did I not do this 7 dresses ago, or years in my sewing career? And this is what shows that reading instructions can be very important and very helpful. So I hope you guys are excited to play with understitching, and stay tuned for next week when we are doing the second part, or the second week of our summertime skill builder series. So I hope you guys have a fantastic day, and happy sewing!